So good evening to everyone. We'll wait just a few moments to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to join the webinar, and then we'll begin promptly. Okay, so my name is Justin Randolph Thompson, and I am the co-founder and director of Black History Month Florence, and also the professor of a drawing course at NYU Florence. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you tonight to this webinar to have a really important conversation within this constellation of events that are happening. Black History Month Florence was born in 2016 as a network, basically, to build solidarity around the kinds of exchange and conversation that are much needed in the context of Italy, and that I think a lot of times are a little bit hidden and don't find those sort of connecting points that allow us to have a dialogue together. In the past 5 editions, we've been able to put together over 250 events, and this current edition has 67 events that happen between Florence, Bologna, Naples, Rome, and Torino. And so it's really a great opportunity for us to really think about how to use this platform that is more digital today in order to really be able to share space. And I think that this event tonight is a real great representation of that, where we have speakers all over the world coming in to join in and share time together. We're really grateful to NYU Florence for hosting this event. And I think it's always important whenever I talk about the work of Black History Month Florence in the context of NYU, it's important to note that NYU was a partner from the very beginning of our project. And actually, some of the work that was done through NYU Florence in 2015 around resignifications and Black portraitures was part of the spark that led to the creation, the development of the context of Black History Month Florence. So I'll invite all of you to go and look into the program, which has many events that you can all follow from abroad, and hopefully you can find some of those, again, connecting tissues and the capacity to expand upon some of the themes that will certainly arise here today, and to think about how to dive deeper in through other conversations that are happening in the meantime. I'm particularly happy tonight about the launching of a book, because I think the launching of any book is sort of like the launching of a conversation. We sort of put books out into the world, and we invite people to join us in conversation, to join us in study. And I think that it's really fantastic when a book is also born with a more collective nature like this one. And so here tonight, we're talking about the Black Mediterranean, bodies, borders, and citizenship. And this book, I think it's important to think about how nearly 30 years ago, we have this groundbreaking book by Paul Gilroy, The Black Atlantic, Modernity and Double Consciousness, and the ways in which that book is drawing upon, you know, the words and work of Robert Farris Thompson, and also upon a text that you know, is more than 100 years old at that point, which is The Souls of Black Folks by W.B. Du Bois, and the ways in which double consciousness and what it means to sort of negotiate multiple spaces, transnationality, and how central that is to a reflection on Blackness. And so I think it's really magical to sort of revisit that and think about the context of the Mediterranean, which I think has long been a site of this kind of exchange, but the research around it has rarely found this kind of collective dialogue. The transnationality of Blackness and its elusiveness, you know, coming out of this realm of movement, non-fixity, the diaspora, in a way that makes it Blackness is very socially concrete, yet completely ethereal. And I think that for that reason, to sit down, negotiate, and collectively study together, there's a really great invitation. When we think about the Mediterranean in the context of Italy, and we think about Blackness in the context of Italy, there's a similar flattening that has happened, particularly in response to media responses to migration. And I think that, you know, this is something that is, again, media driven, but it's also sort of historically evacuated of all the complexities that history has brought to us. And I think that this, historically evacuated narration dominates our consciousness of the Mediterranean as it dominates our consciousness of Blackness in the context of Italy. And so to bring 8 writers together to have a conversation about this, I think is particularly important because it needs this kind of complexity and multiplicity of these voices in order to really begin and expand upon a conversation that is much needed. I wanted to quote from the intro of the book in saying, quote, "What is unfolding in the Mediterranean today is, in part, constitutive of an unparalleled crisis, not a crisis of humanitarianism or of territorial sovereignty, but of Eurocentrism." And I think that this conversation of putting in question and creating a sense of crisis around Eurocentrism is actually really crucial to us today and to our understandings of this space. And I think that also it's possible that historically the Mediterranean has represented a crisis for Eurocentrism. Right. So as the acknowledged expanded of the world from the perspective of Europe, there was this sort of complication of what was understood that was always at work there. When it comes to thinking about Black history, when it comes to thinking about Blackness in the context of Italy, there's 4 central themes that seem to present themselves every year and that seem to dominate also people's imaginations. And they are migration, quite centrally, which comes with it a conversation about mobility and the limitations of it, the access to it, citizenship, labor rights, and then colonial history. And I think that all of these things really work their way into thinking about the Mediterranean, into thinking about the exchanges that are happening there. And so before I pass the word over to Perry Klass, who will be introducing the speakers, I wanted to read a really short quotation that actually comes from a publication that I picked up in 1999 in Sicily that is called Nuove Effemeridi, which is a magazine, a literary magazine. And there was a quote in it from a Yugoslavian writer whose name is Predrag Matvejevic. Hope I pronounced that decently. And it's from a book called The Mediterranean in Europe in 1998. And what he said was, elaborating an inter-Mediterranean alternative culture, creating a project of this sort does not seem imminent. Sharing a differentiated vision is less ambitious, yet this too is not simple to realize. The old ropes submerged that poetry tries to rediscover and rewind have often been broken or torn by intolerance and ignorance alike. And so with that, I will leave the floor to Dr. Perry Klass to give an introduction to the speakers. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much, Justin. I'm Perry Klass. I'm one of the co-directors of NYU Florence, and I want to say how proud and excited we have been to partner in the work that has gone on for Black History Month Florence, and now to say how honored we are to welcome this group of scholars and to welcome this conversation, which, as Justin has said, is, I think, one of many, many, many important conversations that this remarkable book is going to bring about. We are honored to celebrate the scholarship of one of our own faculty members, Professor Angelica Pesarini, but also honored to celebrate the book, the scholarship, and the collective process of scholarship that this book marks. Noting here that in marking and celebrating this book, we are marking a book which intends not only to shape how people rethink the Mediterranean, but also perhaps how people rethink the scholarly processes. So I'm going to introduce our speakers. I'm going to introduce them actually not necessarily in the order that you'll hear from them, but I will, as I go through, mark who you will hear from first. We're very happy to welcome you all again. So Ida Danewid is a lecturer in gender and global political economy at the University of Sussex and a visiting research fellow at the Sarah Parker Remond Center at University College London. And a central strand of her work focuses on transnational movements, anti-colonial internationalisms, and revolutionary struggles against racial capitalism and the many afterlives of empire. We have here with us all the way from Australia, Vivian Durand, who's a research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute of Citizenship and Globalization at Deakin University, and a visiting fellow at European University Institute. And she is also the author of Possible Spaces of Somali Belonging, published in 2016. We will be hearing first from Camilla Hawthorne, who is going to give us a little bit of the genealogy and the history of this project. She's an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And her current project explores the ways that citizenship has emerged as a key terrain of struggle over racial nationalism in Italy, and bringing together insights from critical migration, citizenship studies, and Black studies, argues that citizenship, which Justin just brought up, is crucial for understanding how racism and race are being reconfigured in the 21st century. We will also hear from Giuseppe Grimaldi, who's a researcher at the University of Roma and the founder of Frontiera Sud APS. He's an independent researcher interested in the effects of transnational migrations in Europe, who focuses on the ways that migration patterns from Africa impact on citizenship, belonging, and sense of place, and using a research approach rooted in anthropology and enriched with methodological, analytical, and theoretical tools incorporated from critical geography, sociology, and decolonial studies. We will hear and have a discussion in part moderated by Cristina Lombardi Diop, a senior lecturer in modern languages and literatures and women's studies and gender studies at Loyola University in Chicago. And she's published widely on topics including white colonial femininity, the Black Atlantic and the Mediterranean, African cultural spaces, and African diasporic literature in Italy. We will hear from Gabriele Proglio, who is an assistant professor of modern and contemporary history at the University of Gastronomic Sciences in Italy. Among his recent publications are Debordering Europe, Migration and Control Across the Ventimiglia Region, The Mobility of Memory, Migrations and Diasporas Across European Borders, and The Horn of Africa, Diasporas in Italy, An Oral History. We'll hear from Timothy Raeymaekers, who's a senior lecturer at the Geography Institute at the University of Zurich, who, who has, his current research explores the incorporation of Black African labor in South Italy's agricultural commodity markets and focuses on the spatial conjunctures of race, capital, and territorial sovereignty in this historical Mediterranean frontier. And then finally, we will hear from our own Angelica Pesarini, a member of our faculty here at New York University, Florence, who is a scholar working on the intersections of race, citizenship, and identity in Italy. And her research, which you will hear her talk about, includes the racialization of the Italian political discourse on immigration and the dynamics of race performativity with a focus on colonial and post-colonial Italy. We're so honored to have you all here as members of this collective and so excited to hear your conversation.
Thank you so much for the introductions to everyone, Perry. And so I will go ahead and kick us off by inviting each of you to talk about your own interpretations of the Black Mediterranean. And so we'll begin with Camilla Hawthorne.
Thank you so much. And it's just so exciting for us all to be here together. It's wonderful to see all of your faces, especially comrades and collaborators who I haven't had the chance to see in a really long time due to this pandemic. So I wanted to start by giving a sort of brief overview of the history of this project, and then Gabriele Proglio will also pick up on this story as well. But in 2016, I began working with Kende Andrews, who's a professor at Birmingham City University in the UK. And at Birmingham, they were launching the first Black Studies degree program in the UK. And so Kai and I had, begun talking about the possibility of organizing an event together, an event focused ideally on the Black Mediterranean, because Kayinde and I had met at another event that had taken place earlier that year about Italy, or I'm sorry, in Italy, about global Black diasporic studies. And so with Kai, we organized the first Black Mediterranean Symposium at Birmingham City University that was part of a series of events that were supposed to be for the launch of this Black Studies program. And it included a screening of the documentary Asmarina by the Eritrean Italian filmmaker Medine Paulos, as well as a series of short interventions and reflection pieces about the Black Mediterranean by scholars, including Angelica Pesarini, who was that day a respondent to the film Asmarina. And then because there was so much interest and excitement generated by that event, we organized a follow-up symposium in 2017, where we brought together an even larger group of scholars for both an internally facing event where we were workshopping some of our own writing, as well as a public-facing symposium about the Black Mediterranean, which brought together even more of the scholars who ultimately ended up being part of this book. And what really inspired these gatherings most immediately really was, at least in my experience, the Mediterranean refugee crisis of 2015 to 2016. And part of this was because a lot of the academic scholarship, as well as kind of journalistic reportage happening at that time, was really thinking in a kind of colorblind way about this crisis in terms of the border regimes of Europe, migration, transnational studies, borders. But what was really missing was a close engagement with racism and Blackness in relation to this unfolding Mediterranean crisis. And so for those of us who had been spending years studying the politics of race and Blackness in Italy, we were looking at this crisis and seeing that huge numbers of the people who were coming to Italy through the Central Mediterranean migration route were really from West Africa, and especially the Horn of Africa, former Italian colonies in the Horn of Africa. And it was really surprising and alarming that there wasn't a lot of scholarship that was thinking about what was happening in the Mediterranean in terms of histories of racial formation in Italy, histories of Italian colonialism, and the way that these legacies are being reworked in the present through the fortification of the Mediterranean border. And so one of the things that I think our work on the Black Mediterranean has done that's been so exciting and so provocative is to actually ask these kinds of questions about why these fields are kept separate. Why is it that a kind of traditional migration and border studies, particularly in Europe, is not engaging with race in a really substantive way? And so it was this really exciting opportunity to really pull together this new generation of scholars who are taking on these questions of race, Blackness, whiteness, colonial legacies in Italy, and actually try to build a new language to talk about these questions in ways that I think also have really important implications beyond the Mediterranean as well. Something that I often say a lot in my work is that the Black Mediterranean in many cases is a limit case. So, in the United States, I think there's sometimes a tendency to kind of separate out, Black Lives Matter, abolition politics, the prison industrial complex from, questions of borders and questions from settler colonialism. But in the Black Mediterranean, these questions can't be disentangled from each other. And so it forces us to develop analytics that really think about the way that the current configuration of borders is inextricably tied up with histories of race making and histories of colonialism in ways that then generate insights that we can bring to other parts of the world. And I think, Justin, how am I doing on time? I don't want to encroach on other folks. Right.
You're
good?
fine, Camilla. You can carry on for another minute or two.
Okay, great. And so what I'll just say briefly is that for my chapter in the volume, I took on the question of entanglements of race and citizenship in Italy. And so in short, my chapter is sort of a case study of this moment when a cluster of palm trees that were planted actually by the Starbucks Corporation in the Piazza del Duomo in Milan were set on fire by far-right agitators. And part of the reason why is because these palm trees came to symbolize a sort of dangerous Mediterranean racial incursion into Italian space at the same time as these sort of unfolding national debates, both about Black refugees coming into Italy and about the expansion of citizenship rights. And so I used that controversy over the palm trees as a way to think historically about how race, belonging, and citizenship in Italy have been configured in relation to Italy's position in the Mediterranean and the way that the Mediterranean has historically kind of figured as this source of dangerous racial contamination since national unification. And so again, for me, it was thinking about these connections between Italian colonialism, national unification, and race, and the way that these debates, the way that Italy's location in the Mediterranean has created a unique set of contestations over the boundaries of race and citizenship that continue to resurface in the present. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Camilla. And really, you sort of open up the door to all the complexities that I think will sort of fill out as we move forward. So I will pass straight on to Gabriele Proglio.
Yeah, thank you so much. And nothing to add about the genealogy of this book, of this volume. I would like to talk to you about my chapter. And my chapter is dedicated to a dialogue between the Black Mediterranean debate and Frantz Fanon's thoughts. The idea is to try to problematize the question of colonialism in a post-colonial condition. And so there are many points. First of all, the relationship between the approach in history in trying to investigate oral and archival sources in proposing an history and other ways to approach history. So is part of that history that is invisible because there are invisible sources. For instance, we can talk about irregular migration across borders, how we can produce a history of that kind of historical fact. And another part is about the methodology. I try to problematize the question of the Mediterranean outside the specific geography of history. I mean, how the gaze of the scholar try to consider the North and the South, the East and the West. We can change the gaze trying to have another methodology. And for methodology, I mean post-colonial studies, decolonial thoughts, but also the idea of other ways to approach, in my case, history, such as, for example, the visuality, how visuality is important in trying to move beyond the construction of the source. In the last 10 years in Italy, the debate was on the deconstruction of race, how we can approach the representation. Perhaps now we can move on another important reflection on the structure of the post-colonial condition. And about that, I would like to mention the last part of my topic, on my chapter, that is about the language. The language in a Foucaultian term, I mean, some words such as migrants, such as refugee people, asylum seekers, which are usually used by media for representing these people. And for example, in Italian, giovani or ragazzi for talking about migrants, migrant people. There's a close relationship, in my opinion, with Frantz Fanon's thoughts about the idea of the black, which is not a human being, but is something other, and the idea of a collective, a plurality of a mass of people, which is outside the idea of the human being. So try to start from this base, from a problematization of the source, but also in epistemological term, in my opinion, is a way for reconsidering the Mediterranean as a Black Mediterranean.
Thank you so much, Gabriele, for really evoking the idea of invisible historical sources and different methodologies for recovering them. I'm going to pass the word on now to Ida.
Thanks so much, Justin. So my thinking on the Black Mediterranean is, as I believe that it is so for so many of us, indebted to Paul Gilroy's work on the Black Atlantic. Gilroy, as I'm sure many of you know, very famously wrote about the Black Atlantic as being more than a space of enslavement, exploitation, and racial terror. Right? It was also, he argued, a counterculture which generated new modes of resistance, rebellion, and of relationality. In the chapter that I've contributed to this book, I argue that the Black Mediterranean similarly offers resources for rethinking solidarity and radical politics. And in particular, I suggest that it rearticulates the struggle for migrant justice as being part of a much wider struggle against racial capitalism and the many afterlives of empire. To flesh out this argument, my chapter puts the Black Mediterranean into conversation with the Black radical tradition. I argue that the birth and the development of the world capitalist system from its inception was linked to the creation of highly expendable, super exploitable, and movable laboring subjects, including, of course, African captives, sharecroppers, and indentured servitude workers from Asia. In short, the history of racial capitalism is, at least in part, a history of the control of mobility. As Cedric Robinson reminds us, there has never been a moment in modern European history, if ever before, that migratory and/or immigrant labor was not a significant aspect of European economies. This is, of course, not only a historical fact. Today, in the so-called post-colonial era, mobility controls remain central to racial capitalism in new, but at the same time in old ways. For example, borders work to create and to uphold vast wage differentials between the global north and the global south. And they are thus central to a global system in which multinational corporations are heavily incentivized to outsource production to the cheapest places possible, which is why 83% of the world's manufacturing workforce today lives and works in the global south. At the same time, borders also work to lock undocumented migrants into a state of permanent precarity, vulnerability, and super exploitability. And through that, they create a non-citizen workforce which lacks access to civil and social rights, whether we're talking about unemployment benefits, housing allowance, pensions, and so on. Ultimately, if capitalism, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore has argued, requires inequality, and if racism enshrines it, then the global border regime is one of the main vectors through which this inequality is fabricated, maintained, and renewed. In my chapter, I argued that at least two conclusions follow from this. First, The Black Mediterranean, understood as a history of racial capitalism, reminds us that contemporary calls for closed borders and for nativist social democracy are continuations of, rather than exceptions from, European normality. That is to say, they're part of a long historical trajectory, which has always sought to control the movement of the racial poor. Second, to take this history seriously is to reject the idea that migrant justice is attainable through Western generosity, humanitarianism, hospitality, and pathways to citizenship. To think that the raciality of immigration policies can be stamped out by fairer or even by more open borders is to remain blind to the fact that the modern state, just like capitalism, is a racial project. While calls for hospitality might go some way towards countering the state violence that is unleashed on migrants on a daily basis, they're ultimately incapable of uprooting the structures that render us migrants disposable, precarious, and super exploitable. So in place of these liberal attempts to humanize borders, I argue that the Black Mediterranean teaches us that what is needed is a revolutionary and indeed an internationalist politics, which connects the struggles against the global sweatshop abroad and the exploitation of migrant labor and the multiracial working classes at home, and which through that challenges the wider system of global apartheid that is upheld by borders. Such a politics ultimately rearticulates the struggle for migrant justice as part of a wider struggle against racial capitalism, and thus as part of a long tradition of abolitionist organizing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ida, for bringing us a thought of also the Black Mediterranean as this space generative of also resistance to borders, right? So we're going to pass now on to Timothy Raeymaekers.
Yeah, thanks, Justin, and it's so nice to be here and together with you, and to also expand the conversation. To add to the discussion, my personal engagement with the Black Mediterranean really started from a number of sensations. For example, when my long-term colleague from Central Africa, Congo, joined his wife in the south of Italy around 2011 in Bari, Puglia, and people were laughingly telling him to not make himself illusions because he hadn't arrived in Europe yet. So thinking about the layeredness of humanity and non-humanity in this context. And then a couple of years later, when in the aftermath of the so-called North Africa emergency, growing number of African migrants started occupying abandoned buildings in the city of Bologna, where I was staying. And this was generating a movement of solidarity, not just in Italy, but across Europe, under the slogan, "We're all in the same boat." At the same time, and particularly in Bologna, where I started visiting some of these places and having conversations with their inhabitants, also started rising divisions on ideological grounds, on identity grounds, that to me raised the question, and to many people I talked to, actually, what does it actually mean to be in the same boat in this context? So what are the implications for human relationships across these divisions, across geographic scales, across boundaries? So when I started to experiment with this term of the Black Mediterranean around that time, 2014, 15, I honestly didn't expect that it would create so many connections and it would sort of be picked up so widely. But and for that reason, I'm also very happy to have made these connections with, amongst others, the group here on screen tonight. But I would also be careful not to posit it as a new paradigm. Personally, very similar to Ida, my engagement with the Black Mediterranean figures in a wider interest in what I would call the place of capitalism. So how the spatial politics of race feeds into the operations of capitalist extraction, often across vast geographical scales. So as a cradle of capitalism, if we are to believe Fernand Braudel, I think that the Mediterranean really is a good space to start that inquiry. Considering, for example, the origins of the plantation as a historical mode of production, considering also the intense contact between Europe and Africa during and after colonialism. My chapter, which is based on more or less 5 years of quite intense ethnographic research on the border between Puglia and Basilicata, is really quite, a microscopic case study of a formalization of a so-called migrant ghetto, or an informal labor camp setting in the context of South Italy's globalizing supply chain agriculture. Now, summarizing very quickly, because obviously we're all inviting you all to read the book, I find sort of the existential liminality in which the African workers in this context are placed quite emblematic for a wider dynamic that is characteristic of Mediterranean capitalism since its very inception. And it's a dynamic that I've started to explore together with the members of this collective, in which I'm also trying to summarize a bit more at length now in a personal monograph. I'll keep it at that for the moment, and I look forward to picking up the conversation about these wider implications maybe later on tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much, Timothy, for really sort of creating this vision also of the Mediterranean as this cradle of capitalism, and for bringing us to think about the sort of formalization and the formal qualities also of labor. I'm going to pass the word on now to Vivian, who is joining us all the way from Australia.
Thanks so much, Justin, and thanks all for the invitation to be here. It's a real honor and a privilege. My reflections and my engagement with the Black Mediterranean Project come out of long-term research I've been doing now for really 15 years on migrations to Italy from Somalia. And long-term research has led me into friendships with colleagues in Italy that have led me to think about, for example, citizenship law reform. And my engagement with this book comes into citizenship questions that particularly take place in Italy, where we have a country of immigration now that has been a country of immigration for decades, but still behaves as though it's a country of immigration in the way that it grants citizenship rights to people living outside of Italy who have Italian blood, while denying citizenship rights to people living on Italian soil, but who do not have Italian blood. And this is particularly interesting in the context of migration to Italy from its former colonies for me, because these interrelations between Italy and its colonies are very poorly understood in Italian institutions, and they're starting to become more publicly known now. But it's taking a very long time, and it's interesting that it's taking a very long time, and it's not coincidental that it's taking a very long time, that the kinds of resistances that we see time and time again in Italian institutions, in Italian media, even in education systems, are indicative, I think, of a kind of imaginary that doesn't want to look at its past. And I think in order to really get the kind of change that many have been agitating for the past 20 years in citizenship law reform, there needs to be a reimagining of what it is to be Italian. And that can really only happen, I think, through dialogue, but also through representation and image making that comes out of experiences of navigating the in-between space that opens up this relationship of what it is to be Italian that's much more nuanced than what we're accustomed to seeing. So my chapter in this volume focuses on the racialized citizenship in Italy, and the way that manifests and the way that continues to produce certain kinds of exclusions and inclusions, and how that has been accelerated by dominant platforms now, and the ways in which that has thwarted projects of conviviality, the way that that continues to be a source of deep frustration and injustice on the ground in Italy. My chapter considers the ways in which, I've even got a little slide that I might share with you. Can you see? Yeah. So the ways in which this manifests in a pretty obvious double standard in terms of people that are, as I said earlier, having Italian so-called heritage and blood, living outside of Italy, but continuing to identify as Italian, even maybe having never been to Italy and having even voting rights, while people born in Italy contributing to the country and culture not being considered Italian. And this was a post on Neri Italiani. So that, and then I look most prominently at this Fertility Day campaign that happened in 2016, and the attention that this really draws towards the kinds of double standards at play that seem quite absurd, but actually are really a good illustration of the kind of logics at work in the Black Mediterranean, and the kinds of identifications still so prominent in Italy of wanting to identify with something that is a fiction, but is still, it's a series of divisions that are being mobilized time and time again by politicians like Matteo Salvini. And so on the one hand, there's a desire to see Italy in a particular way, but that desire comes at the expense of many Italians. So it's an exclusivism in imagining what it is to be Italian, what it can be to be Italian. And so my chapter takes that up, and it takes into consideration an encounter that was held in Florence in April 2015 called Reimagining Citizenship, which invited a series of Italian intellectuals of Somali background, Khadija Hassan, Antar Marinkola, and Kara Mohammed Aden, to discuss their writings on what it means to be Italian with Somali heritage. Filmmaker Fred Kuwonu also attended the event and screened his documentary 18 Jus Soli, 18 Jus Soli, which is the age that someone born in Italy needs to be in order to become an Italian citizen if they're not born with Italian blood. So second-class citizens, essentially. So this particular encounter proposed a rethinking of what it means to be Italian, but also a rethinking of citizenship. It brought together these intellectuals I just mentioned, but also it invited former MP Marilena Fabbri of the then Democratic Party. So there was an attempt to bring into dialogue representations that might have supported the proposed reforms in Italian citizenship policy. And later that year, some of the reforms were passed in the lower house, but were then subsequently blocked by far-right influences. I'm sorry, I feel like I've gone over time. How am I going with time?
I think you can just say a couple closing words here, and then we can pick back up. If that works.
So following a long process, Italian citizenship law reforms did not succeed, and I had the privilege of interviewing this former minister several years after the fact, and it became clear that very few understandings of the complex entanglements and colonial relationships were present in some of the citizenship law legislation. So again, even though there was an attempt to modify and make more just a situation that's profoundly unjust, there was no real consideration of the particular trajectories and entanglements Italy has with its former colonies. Thanks. Thank
you so much, Vivian. So I think that, I'm really happy that you were able to sort of tease out also some of the complexities that citizenship brings to the fore and the challenges that are involved in really rethinking and as you said, the desire to reimagine Italianness and the real need for that. So thank you for that. And so I will pass on to Giuseppe Grimaldi.
Yeah. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, everybody, for being here. The Black Mediterranean has proved to be of great importance in my experience as a researcher. And I engaged with this concept during my PhD, since I noticed that the long-term unequal relation between the two shores of the Mediterranean strongly impacted on the formation of Afro-European spaces and subjectivities. My contribution draws on the PhD work on the identification patterns of Italians of Ethiopian and Eritrean origin, the children of post-colonial migrants who arrived in Italy from the 70s on. And by applying the framework of the Black Mediterranean, I tried to challenge a very well-established tradition of studies about children of immigrants. I worked on the concept of second generation. Now, we all know that this concept as a sociological descriptor proved to be totally inadequate. Nevertheless, many authors, especially in migration studies, whether they use the term or not, still focus on what this concept implies. So the continuities due to a common migrant background between the experience of the parents and their children. I decided to focus on intergenerational continuity as well, but in a totally different way. I was not interested in the classical tropes which are the center of the public debate on so-called so-called integration in Italy. I focused instead on the continuities in the ways the experience of marginalization and exclusions of parents in Italy reproduce in the lives of their children. And I think these continuities have nothing to do with ancestral culture or migration experience. On the contrary, it seems that the exclusion of children of immigrants from the national body, even from an institutional point of view, as Vivian just said in the debate about the so-called jus culturae, it is crucial to reproduce what is possible to define Italianness, so a sense of identification in the Italian national identity. I try to explain what I mean. If we look at the axis of exclusion acting on the lives of Ethiopian and Eritrean region, we can see that they incredibly mirror the past and present relation between the two shores of the Mediterranean, and that their lives are in view of a crucial phenomenon for the formation of Italian national identity, such as the colonial and post-colonial presence in the Horn of Africa, the differential relation between northern and southern Italy, the present forced migration across the Mediterranean. I give you just a brief hint of the continuities I try to examine in the chapter. When we talk about Italians of Ethiopian and Eritrean origin, we should better speak of children of domestic workers. In fact, in continuity with the colonial and post-colonial tradition from the 70s on, it was a matter of prestige for the bourgeois of the main Italian cities to have Eritrean and Ethiopian domestic worker 24/7 in their houses. Now, let's try to connect this phenomenon to their family trajectories. Women were never at home to take care of the Italian rich, and men were institutionally invisible and totally unstable. So what about their children? Many of the Milanese of Ethiopian and Eritrean region grew up in boarding schools, mostly Catholic structure, in continuity with the role of the Italian Catholic civilizing mission in the Horn of Africa during colonial and post-colonial times. But for many other families, their precariousness became a source of welfare from below. Many Italians of Ethiopian and Eritrean origin grew up with their neighbors, the southern Italian immigrant sub-proletarians, who lived with them in the occupied houses or in the council houses at the periphery of Milano. The phenomena I just mentioned, colonialism or the Southern question, as you can imagine, are at the heart of the Italian national identity. But they incredibly impacted on children of immigrant lives. They shaped their gender roles, the way they deal with migration, their modes of inclusion in the Milanese setting. And I just want to conclude by clarifying why I use the expression second generation condition. So if the second generation expression is sociologically useless, what if we turn it upside down? What if we use the expression to illuminate all of the structures of inequalities that people with migrant background are confronted with? We are all experiencing now at this time that the Italian hegemonic national identity is reproduced not by defining itself, but by excluding what it considered to be out of its national or symbolic body. No? So drawing on the Black Mediterranean framework, the second generation condition may illuminate on these exclusionary patterns. And most importantly, it can inform us how to take collective action to put in place strategy of liberation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giuseppe, for bringing us about a conversation about the implications of generational divisions and continuities. And so last but not least, we're going to pass the word on to Angelica Pesarini to talk about Black Mediterranean, what it means for you.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you so much. And I cannot say how happy I am to be here after 5 years, been working on this project, seeing all these amazing researchers and scholars being here together gives me a lot of joy. And I'm also impressed because we're doing so well in terms of time. So I don't want to be the one making us late. So I jump into my chapter, but I really hope we will develop conversation later on. So when Camilla was speaking, I was thinking about 2016 when we first met in Birmingham in the UK at this amazing symposium, and how long has been going on since then working on this idea. So when I had to think, when I was invited to think about this new field, for me it was really new, the Black Mediterranean, of course, the Black Atlantic was such a topical book, but I was really thinking about this Black Mediterranean, and I realized that I was already working on it without kind of knowing it, because for me, the Black Mediterranean, as explained in my chapter, is really an important analytical device, because on the one hand, it helps us to debunk hegemonic discursive paradigms on issues of race, identity, and nation, especially also in Italy. And on the other, I heard the word resistance and counterculture, really it helps us to, the Black Mediterranean is a physical, but also symbolic site, is a reservoir of diasporic memories and narrative excluded by the normative whiteness at the core of mainstream processes of knowledge production. And so in my chapter, I start with a couple of quotes from Matteo Salvini, which are a bit ugly, but this really helped me to dig in the past, in this colonial past that has been mentioned so many times. And so I started to talk about the Mediterranean category and how it has been historically resignified. And I have to say, for this part, Cristina, you are here, your work with Gaia, Giuliani, Il Bianco e il Nero, and other books that came out in that period, 2010, 2012, were really important for me to understand such a complex resignification of spaces. And so also the implication of race and colonialism for the construction of Italian national identity, marked by a fragile whiteness, but still a whiteness that needed to be conquered in such a frenetic way by Italians. And so the presence and the negotiations enacted by racialized subjects within the Black Mediterranean really show the importance of diasporic narratives as a form of resistance and counter-history. So after this, I went through my research. I conducted research in East Africa. So we have a big East African presence here tonight in terms of research. So I went to Eritrea, to Somalia, and I conducted interviews with people born from white fascist fathers and East African mothers, so in the fascist jargon called meticci. And it was a fascinating fieldwork for me that was also useful to understand other dynamics, not only academic ones. And so talking with these people in two generations, so connecting with Giuseppe's studies of generational divide, I noticed that specifically some generations of Black Italians who migrated from Eritrea or Ethiopia or Somalia to Italy, they crossed the Mediterranean already in the 50s, but unlike Eritreans and Somali today, they had an Italian passport in their hand. So they had this massive advantage. But when they arrive, they think they are Italian because they have an Italian surname, if they're lucky enough. They speak Italian, they go to Italian school. So they think that going to Italy will be going to a motherland. And then when they arrive, they experience a number of traumas, not only the shock of the arrival for every migrant, going to an unknown and unfamiliar place, and obviously the uncertainty about the possibilities of survival. They were going to Italy, so they were not totally stranger, at least they thought so. Someone was telling me, I remember when I was in Asmara, this person was telling me, oh, Angelica, you know, my dream was to go to Florence. I knew everything about Florence, but I didn't know anything about Eritrean history. And so they had this imagined Italy, this diasporic, I call my chapter diasporic memories, because they have these ideas, this fantasy, but then they arrive in Italy and they experience, as I said, a number of shocks and trauma, the shock of the arrival, but also what I call the shock of the gaze. And so this refers to the visual shock caused by the clash between fantasy and reality, because they were living from Eritrea, where Italians were wealthy. They were living in the best part of town. They had this massive villas that you can still see today. Eritreans were working for Italians, and then they arrive in Naples, they arrive in Rome, and they see Italian men behind the counter serving them coffee. And this is such a disruption of all their colonial logics. And so they were telling me how seeing poor Italians for them was really shocking. They were shocked about the dirt, about the condition of housing and in general in Italy. But also they experienced the shock of the language, for example, because their Italianness was deeply forged on their linguistic identification. And so they arrived in Italy and they hear dialects and they were not used to it. So this person was telling me, when we arrived in Naples, I asked my husband, are we in Italy? Are you sure? Because these Italians, they don't speak Italian. So there was this shock with the language that was their distinctive, one of their distinctive signs of Italianness. And then also a massive problem, the complete removal of their history, of the colonial history. And so when they walk in the streets, people stop them, stare at them, obviously insult them, call them with racial slurs, but also asking them, why do you speak Italian? Where do you come from? And so this was another shock, not knowing, realizing that in Italy, Eritrea, Somalia, Ethiopia did not exist in the collective imagination. It was just Africa. They were just savages. So there were absolutely no knowledge of the colonial past. And so just to conclude, in my chapter, I try to identify the Black Mediterranean as this malleable social space, but also, as I said, this site of diasporic narratives and counter histories. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angelica. And with that, we have all of this amazing content, which I think will invite all of you to step towards the book. But I'm going to pass the word on to Cristina Lombardi Diop to expand a little bit with all of you into the content a little bit deeper.
Hi, thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I think that I cannot undermine the importance of this book at this moment. This is after George Floyd, this is after Breonna Taylor, this is after Breonna Taylor, and this is after the summer of 2020. especially from the perspective I'm speaking for, which is Chicago in the United States. I mean, this book arrives at the moment when we need to rethink how we think about anti-Blackness globally. And so this is a book that really shows us how we need, what language and what kind of perspective we need to adopt in order to understand race and racism and anti-Blackness in Europe and in Italy. And so just briefly, I really find this book fascinating for many reasons. One is that if you look at the contribution of each of the authors, they all come from different disciplinary perspectives. You have a cultural anthropologist, you have a cultural geographer, you have, a scholar who is interested in international relations. There's a lot of, an approach onto critical race theory and cultural history in this book. But in reality, what the book does is really breaking the barriers of disciplinary understanding of what it means to talk about race in Italy with a really fresh focus, right? And the focus is really that finally we're shifting the perspective from Italy and Italians into Black bodies and Black Italians. I think that is a fundamental shift. After being someone who has studied issues of colonial and post-colonial memories and migrations in and out the Mediterranean between Africa and Italy for 20 years, I found this incredibly fresh, right? To think that finally we can think of the post-colonial no longer a moment that is discrete in time, right? And in space, there is a parenthesis, an aberration, right? That we can, that we have to dig out of invisibility, but that post-colonial, that archive, that is the colonial archive and racism in Italy becomes active memory, right? It becomes an active agency for Black subjectivities, right? And so that it seems to me that so far what we have done, in part also because of a focus just on the post-colonial perspective, is to sort of reinstate and reinscribe a sort of white savior complex perspective, right? I think that the scholars in this book, because they come from a generation of scholars who have built their work on the opening of the colonial archive. They're building on something that has been done by historians of different perspectives, Ethiopians, Italian, and Libyan, and Somali historians on the colonial archive. They can now speak after the archive, right? After the archive has been opened, and they can really speak from the perspective of counter narratives. Many of you have mentioned counter narratives. I totally, against the hegemonic narratives of the nation state, but beyond that, also against the hegemonic understanding of race in Italy as, in fact, whiteness. Okay, so race is not just whiteness, and Black diasporic consciousness is in Italy to stay. Okay, and so I also love the fact that, as Ada has pointed out, the Black Mediterranean, as you all understanding, is opening the long duration of Italy into the making of Black capital, like racial capital, not simply limited to the scramble for Africa, but going back to a decolonial perspective, which is the long durée of this transatlantic slavery, right? There was slavery in the Mediterranean, okay, in antiquity and in the Renaissance. We need to open that archive as well. And I think that this book, even if not considering that directly, it's giving all of us new tools to conceive of that history as part of the present and its lingering effect. And so all of a sudden, what was then, visible becomes invisible, becomes visible, especially the presence of Blacks in Italy over the centuries, since antiquity, right? Relationships of exploitation and domination and subordination, of a slow formation of identity that is heterogeneous and hybrid, right? That has been going on for centuries. And so finally, I think this book also speaks against disciplinary normativity, that has somehow kept us stuck into really discrete. You don't know how hard it's been to create something like post-colonial Italian studies. It's been very hard because the historians were against it, because the literary critic were against it, because the Italianists hated the idea, okay? And so it seems to me that finally the authors in this collective effort, like coming together for so many different areas of expertise and having so many different interests, are finally just not even dealing with those boundaries anymore. They don't even thematize it. It's not even important to them. Except that I think there is a strong desire to break with the understanding of Italianness as a monolithic homogeneous identity. And that to me it's a great pleasure to see that happening. It seems that finally, we are at the moment where we can speak from the perspective of the Southern question, or the self-orientalism of Italians as Mediterranean, from a Black perspective, from a perspective of Black subjectivity, no longer of Italian white subjectivity. And finally, and I'll begin my question to all of you, and I just want to make clear to the audience and to the authors here, I have formulated 2 or 3 questions for everyone, and these are not at all the only points you want to discuss. I think the discussion that follows in the next 20 minutes or so, 25, should be more of a dialogue among you on issues that are of importance. It's great that Justin and NYU has given you a forum for us to listen to you debating issues. And so I'm just going to give some hints, perhaps. But my first question then would be more on the idea of political activism. How do you see yourselves as engaged scholars? And some of you are, out there doing political activism. How do you all understand the role of social and political activism in its linkage to anti-Blackness struggles in Italy, anti-racist struggles in Italy, and the Black Mediterranean more openly, and more perhaps, that's the first question, I guess. Anyone who wants to break the ice?
I can say a few words, in part because the ethnographic research for my book is really involves working alongside activists, and so I spent between 2013 and 2019 working with Black Italian activists who were doing projects around citizenship reform, around mutual aid with refugees, around, or even sort of cultural workers who were trying to sort of make space in the national discourse for the legacies of colonialism. And so, for me, my work has always, I think the lines between activism and scholarship are blurred in a really productive way. And I also think that I see activism in Italy, the activism that's unfolding, as a site of knowledge production. So, I try to approach these unfolding activist struggles not as a researcher who's coming in and is adding a kind of theoretical framework on top of the work that they are already doing. And in fact, I think that there is some work that tends to do this that I'm trying to push back against, that says, for instance, if you are organizing for citizenship, then you are making yourself complicit in the racial state. It's like, well, actually, if you sit in meetings with activists, you understand all of the complicated conversations that people are having every day in their activism, in their lived experience, about the limits of citizenship, about what it means to work within and against and alongside and an agonistic relationship with the racial state, thinking about the ways in which citizenship can become a stepping stone to enable other kinds of diasporic politics. And so for me, my approach has always been to really think about activists in Italy as as theorists of racial capitalism, as theorists of race and anti-Blackness and post-coloniality, and to sort of work with and alongside them and allow that sort of engagement with the messiness, the everyday, the contradictions and complications of activism on the ground, to allow that to kind of inform my own theorizing and thinking. And I just think it's been such an incredible, even just the last 10 years, even fewer than 10 years, the explosion of organizing that's happening specifically around the category of Black Italianness or Afro-Italianness, and what that's opened up in terms of generating public conversations, not only about the existence of Black Italians, right, who have been in Italy for as long as there has been in Italy, but really kind of forcing into the national conversation a serious engagement with questions of race and racism that's not just referential to the United States.
I know thank you, Camilla. This is very important, and thank you for sharing with us your understanding of what it means to politically work for new forms of citizenships in Italy. It's very, very important work. I know there are others you want to talk about. Your activism, your work, your field work, your work, in the ground.
Yeah, I can say a few words about this, and it's about the way I reframe the concept of Black Mediterranean work during my PhD in my experience now as a activist and a researcher activist in southern Italy. Because if we say that the reality is that the Mediterranean border that in the present public debate divides the global north and the global south extends far beyond Lampedusa, and southern Italy, we created an organization called Frontiera Sud, because we think that southern Italy is a frontier. It's a frontier, and migration opened the possibility to see this frontier. The so-called refugees crisis open to the silence of this phenomenon in southern Italy, which was totally silenced, despite it was a constitutive phenomenon in the last decades. So we started to talk about reception. We started to talk about ghettos, as Tim said. But this phenomenon illuminates not only on the migrant presence, they illuminate on more salient phenomenon, as you said, Christina, before. For example, the reception system illuminated on clientelism, or on the abandonment, on the ghettos illuminates on the abandonment of the territory as a strategy of governing the territory. At the same time, this process illuminates on the way southern Italy is framed within the Italian and European hegemonic discourse. So by working south as an Afro-European frontier, it's possible to approach both the southern question and the European border regime and its violence. And we constituted an organization to work on this phenomenon, and we tried to apply a decolonial approach to work in the schools, to work in the agricultural ghettos, to make sense of the migrant presence as a tool to decolonize South. So starting from the migrant presence, I think that this is like a one life possibility, let's say, no? The present migration and its salience in southern Italy can be a possibility, can be a strong possibility to decolonize southern Italy, and we are trying to do this with our organization.
Thank you, Giuseppe. You're publishing on this, right?
I'll try. I don't know. I don't know. Man, I don't know. We'll see.
There's a color line that begins sort of Eboli, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, maybe I can just add to that. I mean, in the context that I was just describing of exactly these migrant ghettos and the drive to formalize these in the institution of formalized migration reception centers and so on. I remember a conversation I had with Camilla when she told me exactly, I mean, what the state seems to be promoting here is a kind of a neoliberal hybridity, right? Sort of setting the terms under which migrants are to be incorporated within the racial states, exactly. And it made me think that actually, I mean, when talking about the state in Italy, we're talking about many different things or different kinds of states, maybe even, you know, while at the same time, exactly, there is this drive. I also saw, particularly in the context that I was participating in when doing the ethnography for my chapter, where police officers, judges, lawyers, civil society organizations that were actively siding with, you know, what I would call a resistant state, yeah, maybe in the shadow of this neoliberal state, and so I think the Black Mediterranean, as I was highlighting before, is also inviting us to see that layeredness, not just from you know, a state-centric political perspective, but from the existential, let's say, liminality in which people who at the same time are excluded and included on in unequal terms is being played out, you know. So I think, I mean, just to answer your question, Camilla, a bit more broadly from my perspective, I mean, the Black Mediterranean, it's really about claiming and occupying that marginalized space, yeah, and it's about sitting in that apparent contradiction. But also then we're also talking about ourselves, right? As researchers and as people who are actually, you know, observing these dynamics. We can't pretend to not be involved in them. Huh? So we have to think carefully about our own positionality, as Stuart Hall was already inviting us to do a long time ago. Exactly. So yeah, I'll keep it at that for a moment.
Jumping on this, actually, I was thinking about us here, all connected to university, right? So what a neoliberal institution is university. So we're all here in this incredibly privileged position. And also how university is structured in a way where, you know, certain knowledges are not well accepted because they challenge this production of knowledge that is embedded and drenched in whiteness. And I had the great honor to contribute the translation of a book, Under Commons, by Fred Motem and Stefano Hartney, and they were talking about the relationship with this neoliberal institution. And so they said something that for me was mind-blowing in a way, because they were saying the only relationship we can have with the university is a criminal relationship. In the sense, we should be within, but challenge it, because the university needs subversive intellectual, so people able to bring these alternative epistemologies. And so this is a bit the way I see, in a very modest way, the sort of activism I do from my own perspective. So using and bringing new methodologies that are considered not scientific enough, that are considered naive, that are considered not objective. But these are the knowledges that also are part of this marginalized space that we have been talking about, how in our own profession, we can reoccupy certain spaces? How can we decolonize certain spaces? And how we can bring this reservoir of counter narratives that are present in the Black Mediterranean, how they can contaminate this white knowledge we are all surrounded by and embedded in.
I think that for question of time, then I know that the audience also has questions, and we have time dedicated to the questions from the audience pretty soon. I do have one extra question if we have time, Justin. I do have a question about exactly. I mean, we are coming up with a series of counter epistemologies that come from all over this diasporic space, which is the Black Mediterranean. But I wonder how global is the Black Mediterranean? Is it about Black diasporic connections? And it is also about connection to the Black Lives Matter movement. And how can we create some form of solidarities? And Ida, talked about that. In fact, it's one of the things that the Black Mediterranean does is to perhaps extend the idea of abolitionist fights across different geopolitical spaces. And so I wanted to ask all of you, how global do you think that is the Black Mediterranean?
I guess I'll jump in again. I think it's an interesting question, since for this book we are really our scholarship is focused on Italy, and yet at the same time I think it's important to understand that Italy doesn't exhaust the geographies of the Black Mediterranean, right? And I think that there are these incredible opportunities to connect with emerging scholarship on, Blackness in Spain and Portugal and Greece. There are scholars, I'm thinking of Amson Hagen, for example, who's, thinking about the anti-Blackness that Black migrants experience before they even cross the Mediterranean, but as they're crossing through Niger and the Sahel and Libya, right? The infamous story of the Libyan slave markets, which Khalil Saucier talks about in his piece in our volume. And so, for me, I've kind of come to the Black Mediterranean. I use it in two ways in my work, right? First is as a way of sort of provincializing the Black Mediterranean and kind of bringing analytical and geographical and historical specificity to the ways that we talk about histories of racial formation and racial capitalism in the Mediterranean, right? By saying that there are a unique set of roots and routes and struggles and circulations of capital that we have to really attend to understand the conditions of possibility for Black organizing in Italy, but also more broadly in the region. But then also I've started really trying to think about the Black Mediterranean, not just in terms of what it does as a descriptor, as a descriptive kind of geographic category, but also as a political demand. And so this is where I think that, it links up to the question that you were asking, Christina, about, Black Lives Matter. And I'm thinking about, Ida's work and, what does it mean to expand, what does it mean to use the language of abolition in the context of these struggles? Or, even Giuseppe's work on, Eritrean communities in Milan, and the way that, thinking about these histories of Black struggle and Black placemaking in the Mediterranean necessarily subverts state categories and these kinds of divisions between, second generation versus migrant versus refugee versus asylum seeker, and can actually open the way to new kinds of new forms of solidarity that don't rely on state categories, but that are actually kind of drawing off of and activating these shared trans-Mediterranean histories, right? Whether it's, internal colonization and southernization in the South, histories of Italian colonialism and anti-colonialism, that can actually pave the way for a broader, more capacious Black diasporic politics.
Wonderful. Thank you, Camilla. Anybody else who wants to jump in with this question or maybe other questions that you want to bring up before we open to the general forum, to the public? Anything that you would like to bring up to this conversation that we haven't touched upon so far?
If I can, yeah. I would like to add just one thing about the question of decolonization of the culture. So we talk about that. In my opinion, the idea of the Black Mediterranean is an opportunity, in the sense that if the Mediterranean is the production of Europe, of different narrations, I would like to quote Stuart Hall in another perspective, in the sense of discursivity about the Mediterranean, a colonial discursivity, but also a post-colonial, in the sense after the fall of empires. In my opinion, it's possible to analyze counter narratives or counter discourse only trying to propose other approaches, other gazes on the Mediterranean. In this sense, the Black Mediterranean is an opportunity. In my opinion, the resistance is outside the history. Two possibilities, two options are possible: resistance and repression. But the idea of resistance is outside history, because it is outside the archive of history. So for trying to analyze the resistance, we have to invent a tool for analyzing this kind of resistance. And for example, this kind of approach is very important in oral history, because the source is outside the idea of the physical archive. So for replying to your question, Christina, I think that in my opinion, the Black Mediterranean is an opportunity, but is also a question of alliance between different subjectivities, in the sense that we have different positionalities, we have different approaches, and there are many fields, many powers, not only a unique hegemonic power, but different powers working on the Mediterranean, on a global Mediterranean. And our unique possibility is to try to propose alliances between different subjectivities and different positionalities. In this sense, activism, in my opinion, is part of this kind of resistance.
Thank you, Gabriele. Yes, makes a lot of sense.
Ida and Vivian, do you want to conclude this round of question before we go to the other questions? You have amazing work, so it would be nice to hear from you too.
I would like to say something about the role of image making and potentially forging alliances. So I think that representations and image making can do some of that work by creating spaces of interactivity. We can see that in a lot of the works produced by members of the Somali diaspora, for example, in Italy, and the ways in which that has opened up new spaces for considering what it means to be not just Italian, but a citizen, and to think about the Mediterranean in another way, in a fresh way, that reclaims its Black histories. So I would like to just offer that reflection. Thanks.
Maybe
Absolutely.
back to your question, Christina, right? You asked how global is the Black Mediterranean? I think one of the things that I'm grappling with, not only in this particular chapter, but in other places in my work, is also to what extent is the Black Mediterranean a product of the global, right? And I think that's very much what I'm trying to work with. And I think one of the beautiful things about this book, as so many of you have already mentioned, right, is that it really pushes against the idea of methodological nationalism, right, and of different disciplinary boundaries. And for me at least, one of the really productive aspects of that is that that opens up space for thinking about how the history of borders is also a history of policing, for example, right? Like historically, these are things that have emerged in a very intimately connected way, right? And right, not only in the Black Mediterranean, but also across the globe in different colonial spaces and so on, right, have traveled back and forth in a kind of boomerang-like way. And so I think in the same way that we must ask, how global is the Black Mediterranean? I think it's also important to turn around and ask, to what extent is, you know, the present in the Mediterranean today a product of these other global dynamics?
Thank you, Aya. And, you know, I happen to teach a course on borders, and, you know, because from where I speak from, I obviously talk a lot about the US-Mexico border. And when I bring the Black Mediterranean to my students, they are incredibly, they see connections I don't see, meaning that there, you know, there is an awareness of, you know, the incredible pervasiveness of not simply temporal but spatial of the kind of exploitative and practices that, you know, that we see happening in the Black Mediterranean, that in fact not wanting to just oppose everything, but simply understand that there is a larger fight and struggle that needs to be acknowledged. Yeah.
Thank you so much for all of this dialogue. I think to shift gears and to open up also to the questions that have arrived from the audience, I've sort of woven together two of these questions that I think draw upon a number of things that have been mentioned, and maybe give a chance to all of you to elaborate a little bit more in thinking about colonial history and also image making and maybe institutional policing. So one of the questions is, can we talk about a post-colonial Italy when the laws and social perception of identities are still very much tied to Italy's colonial past or present? Sorry, I skipped the word there. I'll read it once more. Can we talk about post-colonial Italy when the laws and social perception of identities are still very much tied to Italy's colonial past or present? And I think as a sort of segue into another question, which is about institutional roles, this is talking about the forthcoming Museo Italo-Africano, Ilaria Alpi, and you know, the ways in which that particular institution is being developed with very little input that is coming from non-white sources. So maybe there's a way to think about image making and continuity and all of these sort of intertangled things.
I'll jump in, but maybe from an unexpected perspective, in the sense that I think it's surprising, again, thinking about the layeredness of the Black Mediterranean, or surprising or not, that actually the infrastructures of racial segregation that characterize the contemporary Mediterranean plantation economy are those that served during fascist years to jumpstart an agricultural reform and a colonization of the countryside across Euro-African borders, with, you know, surprisingly very similar technologies. And so when I started digging deeper into that issue, I mean, without wanting to become like a ruin fetishist, I think that the technology of territorial residence today is still a kind of an invisible border, as somebody calls it, that segregates bodies, you know, within the Italian territorial landscape. I invoke one of the fascist laws that was only abolished in 1961 that actually prevented certain Italians from taking up a residence in the cities of Milan and Turin, while their laborers employed in the factories and so on, right? And so if today you look at the Bossi-Fini law and its extensions, I think they are really based on the same kind of logic. So, I mean, in the larger project that I'm engaged in personally, I really want to push that boundary or like push that discussion around the Mediterranean even further and think about it in the context of the Anthropocene, in the way in which actually, the very thinking about let's say what can be extracted and what is sort of fruitful to capitalism and what can be incorporated as capitalist value is also based from its very beginning, as Sida was mentioning, on this this territorial segregation, on these technologies of separation. So exactly. So can we talk about post-colonially when the laws are still very much tied to colonial times? Yes, I mean, maybe you were expecting a different discussion here about citizenship and so on, but I also wanted to sort of mention this point in this respect.
Well, jumping on this, Tim, you were talking about the fascist laws and yes, how can we talk about post-colonial Italy? I think, well, Cristina, you wrote this with Caterina Romeo, you wrote this textbook, Post-Colonial Italy, right? That was so important for, I think, many of the people here. And I was thinking about this question, the impacts of coloniality in our everyday life. So even if you are maybe historically in a post-colonial phase, we are still embedded in a colonial frame of mind. Our institutions are embedded in a colonial frame of mind. And talking about laws, what's the best example is the citizenship law. That seems such a neutral law, ius sanguinis, right of blood. And then you dig a bit and you see that actually it doesn't come from the fascist time, it's even earlier, from the Italia Liberale, the liberal time. And I discovered this reading the work of a fantastic Italian historian, Gianluca Gabriele, when he was explaining this, that actually, in the colonies, for example, in Eritrea, the first colony, so-called in 1890, already in 1909, the government needed to think about citizenship for Black mixed-race Italians. And that was the problem. They could be Italian by blood if the father was giving them their surname, but they were still Black. And then when the fascists take power in 1933, they need to think again about this issue, the meticciato that is contaminating the purity of the race. And then again, we mention the white race. So they could get citizenship if they were showing in their body signs of the white race. And now we are in 2021, where almost 1 million people are excluded from the nation, even if they were born and raised here, still based on these bloodlines. And so it really, the question is, who is really a citizen? Who is the real Italian in here? And what is the impact of this colonial mind still present? A few days ago, I was listening to an interview by an MP from the right-wing party Fratelli d'Italia, and he was mentioning, colonialism. And I was really shocked in a way, because it was really illustrating point by point the myth Italiani brava gente, that we think it may, come on, we're in 2021, probably is gone, actually still very alive. In Eritrea, we build streets and hospitals. If you go there, you will see our streets in 2021. So I think there is a lot of work to do on deconstructing this coloniality we are so drenched in.
Can I just say something that, Angelica, your point about the fact that this isn't just a fascist story, but it's really a story of liberal Italy, I think is really important. Again, because, so many of us, we work in Italy and we use Italy to think about the Black Mediterranean. And I think that there's often a kind of impulse to look at this political moment and say, the kind of global resurgence of fascisms, oh, well, we can look to Italy because, Italy really was the first fascist country, in Europe in the 20th century. But I think, sometimes I worry about this overwhelming focus on the fascist period because it often frames these kinds of racial state policies and actions and practices as a kind of aberration, right? Whereas, I think particularly in Italy, right, this is a great example that the Italian state was concerned with questions of racial identity and the management of racial difference from the moment of national unification, right? Both in relation to the South and in relation to the colonies on the other side of the Mediterranean. And so I think when we apply that to something like citizenship, it's a reminder that, it's not that citizenship becomes racialized in the context of, say, a fascist government, but that the category of kind of liberal nation state citizenship is itself racialized from the start, right? And this is where I often draw on David Theo Goldberg's work on the racial state, right? That, the reason for the existence of the modern state is about managing difference, right? When we think about Locke and Hobbes, it's always been about managing difference. And so it forces us to ask a totally different set of questions about citizenship, right? It's not, can we deracialize citizenship, but what political alternatives are there to citizenship? And again, to kind of go back to these questions about abolition, when we're talking about abolition, are we actually also talking about the abolition of citizenship as this political modality for, regulating access to rights and personhood altogether? And I think we only really get to that when we acknowledge that this is much deeper than just a fascist history.
I totally agree with you, Camilla. And, if I can jump in, and one of the things, the problem with exceptionalism has been, that the historiography of fascism from Benedetto Croce to Gentile has been one of exceptional. And I think that the Agamben idea of the state of exception has inherited that legacy of considering the migration crisis and the camps, and we've gone on for, years over this as an exception to some kind of European humanitarianism, right, of post-Enlightenment. And I think that this is extremely problematic, which has been one of the difficulties of talking about post-colonial Italy, right? Because the post-colonial could only be in relation to the colonial archive, right? Which was fundamental. I think we forget how fundamental that work was, but it was important. It was absolutely important. And I think that, what you all do in Angelica, Giuseppe, and you and Timothy, are you really pushing forward that work, right? But that work actually got us a little stuck in a sense that, you couldn't jump over contemporary times. How many times I've been told that, by Nicola Labanca, no, Christina, you can't jump to contemporary times. We're talking about colonial history here. So it was a monolithic archive, it couldn't spill.
So we've all been we've all been told that sentence then, because I heard that sentence so many times. Angelica, did you jump to the present? How? Okay, so I'm glad I was not the only one.
I would like to add that, in my opinion, is a question of mothers and fathers, in the sense that there's a specific language used for producing knowledge. I would like to mention history, but I think in every discipline this happen in Italy. And for example, struck me very much the use of repression for talking about the idea of how colonial memory was part of the problem of the post-colonial condition, in the sense that the Italian debate used repression in a psychoanalytic term for trying to give an interpretation to the idea of racist Italy. And the very interesting thing is that according to psychoanalytic thesis, repression is experienced by a person who experienced violence. So I would like to ask how Italian colonizers experience violence. This is a very, very important topic, in my opinion, because if we want to decolonize something, we have to understand the processes, how knowledge was produced, and what kind of society we want together. Other ways, we only deconstruct something. We can use this kind of reflection for memory, but also for other kind of topics.
I don't know if Vivian wants to chime in on what you started to talk about in regards to image production, and maybe in relation just to this idea of the role of institutions in sort of the conservation or the revisitation or the rethinking of the ways in which images remain, and in a rebranding process, the importance of image production.
Thanks, Justin. I was thinking as you were speaking, Gabriele, about this idea of repression and the way that it can be experienced by people who have experienced violence. And it's interesting to think about some of the far right activity and the kinds of tractions that has now, and the way that it's sanctioned through institutions, but also the way that it seems to resonate and take on a life of its own, as so much image production does online. And thinking about the kinds of grievances into which these narratives of exclusivist whiteness tap into, I think is a really productive way to think through some of the divisions, and also to think perhaps the ways in which we might begin to heal as well, not in a simple way at all, but in a way that uncovers the violences as they multiply through history and the way they continue to multiply on different bodies in different ways. And only by acknowledging, I think, as Gabriele says, also the kinds of violence that come out of these sites of repression and the violence that cause the sites of repression, can we begin to really unpack what's behind some of these dynamics. And that can happen at an institutional level, but it can also happen at a level of the way things play out on social media. And they can these discourses reinforce one another, as far as I can tell. And we have a lot of work to do as well in online spaces in terms of enabling and deplatforming, and then who decides on what's deplatformed and who decides on which voices are enabled. It's very complex.
Okay, there was one question that I think might, because I think that in the conversation we ventured through in thinking about the geographic space of Italy, the south of Italy, and maybe touched a little bit less on the north. There was a question that came in about the north of Italy, and the question was about the imaginaries of Padania, small industries and agricultural industrialism, and how those might relate to racialized migrant labor in the creation of themselves. So I don't know if there's anyone who wants to chime in on that. It's maybe a specific element, but I think that in general, sort of thinking about the dimension of the North and these sorts of distinctions that get created within the territory of Italy, maybe it's a helpful place to go.
A number of us did ethnographic research in the North. And I think, in part because that, at least right now, is still where kind of demographically Black Italy is concentrated, although that balance is shifting to the South in ways that are, and this is, I think, where Tim's work is so important in terms of thinking about those regional differences. as well in the kind of racial capitalist regimes of Italy. On this question, I also really recommend the work of Rebecca Feinberg, who's done some really important work on migrant labor in the wine industry in northern Italy. But what I'll just say briefly for me is, where it came up, I did there's a whole chapter of my, my own book that's about Black Italian entrepreneurs and the particular conditions under which kind of Black cultural entrepreneurship became this space in which Black Italians have been attempting to kind of make claims about their worthiness as potential citizens. And a lot of that is, it's both tied to the kind of racialization of migrant labor and the particular immigration regimes in Italy that link legal immigration to the job market, but also in the context of Milan, where a lot of these projects are concentrated, there is this kind of sense of, the North being a site of labor and entrepreneurialism, right? So there's a very specific kind of local cultural context that makes these claims to citizenship via economic productivity legible, I think, that again, has a lot, tells us a lot about racial capitalism, and something that I talk about in my chapter in this book is the way in which Black Italians are often constrained to make appeals to the state for inclusion by positioning themselves as laboring bodies, right? Whether it's through physical, manual agricultural labor or kind of intellectual or creative, the production of cultural capital.
Yeah, it's so interesting because during my PhD, I had the possibility to notice this way of self-identify between the people I was working with. So Italian people born and raised in Milano with Ethiopian and Eritrean parents. And I was the Southerner for them. So they were the Northerner, and I was the Southerner, and they were joking about this. No, they were I don't know, changing my accent or amplify my accent as let's say, yeah, it's striking how you put in place your identity as a way to create a relation, and so the incorporation of this imaginaries is so strong. just to understand how this how can be strong the way of creating this relation, let's say. No, it's so strong, and so for sure it's part of the hegemonic identity itself. No? So, and every identity is very multi-sided. So as an anthropologist, I needed to notice that.
Okay, well, I think that we can maybe sort of come to a close here after such a enriching conversation that has been, it's a lot to digest. And I think it's also really just that sort of a preface to us getting into the book itself. But I'll pass the word over to Perry Klass and Larry Wolff to say some closing remarks. And thank you all for being with us again.
Want to echo our gratitude to everyone for joining from different parts of the world, and want to again say this has been an amazing conversation, and this is clearly a book that is meant to ensure that these conversations do go on, that, as many of you have pointed out, that they draw in people from different disciplines and bend and break and change disciplinary boundaries, even as they challenge people to consider the question of geographical boundaries and of colonialization and decolonialization, and all of the many topics, too many to even list, that you have talked about and raised, from migration and citizenship to the questions of intergenerational continuities and discontinuities, to institutional roles, and to everything, including image production, memory, and the understanding of counter-narratives. It's been an honor and a privilege to listen and to host you.
I would just want to add to that, that NYU is particularly proud and engaged with the issues that are raised in the book. We're proud to be part of this through Angelica Pesarini, who connects us to the rest of you and the Black Mediterranean Collective Project. But NYU itself is both present on the Mediterranean with a number of its global sites and has a Center for European and Mediterranean Studies back in New York. And the urgency of thinking about the Mediterranean is something that is on our minds as a university. Speaking as a European historian, in conclusion, one of the things I would say is that for historians, the gigantic work of Fernand Braudel, now must be 60 years ago, has been in some ways an obstacle to moving forward and thinking about the Mediterranean, because it was such a titanic masterpiece for its time, and perhaps especially an obstacle for thinking about the modern and contemporary Mediterranean, since it was so very much focused on the world of the 16th century. And one of the things that's moving to me about looking at some of the pieces of the book, which I've just begun to read, are the ways in which current political and social issues have driven a new academic discussion of the Mediterranean, and how fundamental those issues are for compelling us as academics to rethink some of the things that we've taken for granted about understanding Mediterranean history, and thinking about the ways in which it integrates both into European history, Middle Eastern history, North African history, and putting together those pieces in a contemporary framework. Congratulations to you all on having, published this volume and raised an agenda that people are going to be talking about for the rest of our academic lives, no doubt about that.
Well, thank you so much. I wanted to thank the organization of this webinar. So people that we don't see on the screen, Alexa, Lucia, they've been really managing everything. So I really wanted to thank them all. Thank NYU for hosting us, and thank Justin and for moderating this debate with Christina, and also Larry and Perry for your presence and your intervention here at this webinar. And I feel really honored to have been here with you all.
Grazie, grazie a voi. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Grazie a
Bye.
tutti.
Grazie a tutti.
Grazie.
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 Grazie.